We live in a sinful world, and the people of this world will constantly try to pressurize us to forsake God and to forsake His people. But we must remain determined in our commitment towards God and His people. In the Bible, we find several examples of people who were not able to keep that commitment. And one such person was Prophet Balaam. A Moabite king, Balak, offered great rewards to Prophet Balaam if he could just come and curse the nation of Israel. He actually made multiple attempts to pressurize Balaam. But every time Balaam kept refusing because God had told him not to curse the nation of Israel. In fact, he kept blessing them according to the message that he had received from God. But in the end, Balaam just could not keep up with that commitment because he wanted the reward which King Balak had promised. Although he could not curse Israel directly, he came up with a plan where Israel would do something that would lead to a curse. He came up with a plan to tempt Israel to commit idolatry and adultery with the woman of Moab. And because of this, when this plan succeeded, God sent a plague upon Israel, and on that day 24,000 Israelites died. So the story of Balaam is a man who could not keep up with his commitment towards God and towards his people. And the Bible calls him as one who loved the wages of unrighteousness. The Bible talks about the error of Balaam. And Jesus actually warns one of the churches in Revelation about the teaching of Balaam. But today in our passage, there is a strange irony. Tables have turned. This time it's an Israelite woman who is trying to pressurize a Moabite woman to go back to her people and to her gods. We see how this Moabite woman, Ruth, was determined in her commitment towards God and Israel, despite the pressure. And so let's read this passage, Ruth chapter 1, verse 15 to 18. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. There are two important things we can learn from this passage, and the first point is that people will put pressure on us to forsake God and His people. Let me repeat that. People will put pressure on us to forsake God and His people. In last week's passage, Naomi was speaking to both Orpah and Ruth. And at the end of that passage, we saw how Orpah kissed goodbye to her mother-in-law Naomi. Now in today's passage, Naomi continues to speak with Ruth, who was still clinging on to her. Naomi tells her in the very first part of verse 15, "Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Now, watching Orpah disappear from their horizon, Naomi points to her and tells Ruth, behold. Naomi wanted Ruth to fix her eyes on Orpah. And she tells her that Orpah has gone back. Now that phrase, gone back, is actually the same phrase which Naomi has used 3 times so far in her conversation with Orpah and Ruth. And every time she is telling them to go back to their mother's house. For example, in verse 8 she said, go, return, or it's the same word, go back, go, return each of you to your mother's house. In verse 11 she said, she repeated that command again. She said, return, go back, my daughters. And in verse 12, she again repeated that command saying, return or go back, my daughters. Now, in our verse, Naomi is telling Ruth that see, Orpah has returned. She has gone back. What is she trying to tell Ruth? She's telling Ruth, see, Orpah has obeyed my command. She has understood that it is not practical for her to go with me to Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And Naomi's words were intended to put pressure on Ruth to go back. She was trying to ask Ruth, will you not obey my command? Will you also not be practical like Orpah? She's trying to say that go back just as your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Now Orpah's decision to go back or return, as you can see there, led her to her own people and to her old gods. Because Naomi says in the very first part of verse 15, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. You know, what we can learn here is that decisions based on practical considerations of life definitely have spiritual repercussions. Let me repeat that for you. Decisions made based on practical considerations of your life have spiritual repercussions. You see, Orpah's decision to go back to her people meant that she would be going back to the gods that the Moabites worship. Moabites worship Chemosh. They were not monotheists like the Jews. Monotheists worship one god. These Moabites were actually henotheists. Who are henotheists? Henotheists are those who worship one god without denying the existence of other gods. Moabites venerated Chemosh because he was considered to be their divine patron. Moabites venerated Chemosh because they believed that they received their protection and prosperity from him. But they also believed in other smaller gods. By going back to her Moabite family, Orpah has now placed herself in a situation where she will once again be influenced by the Moabite religion. Going back to her family meant she was going back to her idolatrous ways. That is why Naomi says that Orpah has gone back to her gods. Do you realize the effect of Naomi's words on Orpah? She, with all good intentions, Naomi advised her to go back to her mother's house, because staying with her family she would have a better chance at getting remarried and settling down in life. And so Naomi, with all good intention, told Orpah to go back to her mother's house. But that decision to go back to her mother's house would also mean that Orpah would go back to her old idolatrous lifestyle. What we can learn here is that a lot of people will try to advise us about the decisions we need to make in our lives. And some of these people will be people whom we respect and look up to. Some of them will give us some very good practical advice. But you must also think about the spiritual repercussions of that advice. Every advice can have a spiritual repercussion. And, advice can have a negative spiritual repercussion. And those negative spiritual repercussions will eventually lead you away from God and lead you to eternal destruction. You must be especially careful about the kind of people with whom you decide to spend the rest of your life. A lot of people will give you a lot of advice that will lead you to different places. But you must be careful whom you choose to lead the rest of your life with. If you choose to separate yourself from believers, you will surely stray away from the one true God. If you choose to be constantly surrounded by unbelievers, you will not be untouched by their religion, by their idolatry. You will slowly go back to your old sinful ways. So, what we can learn is that weigh every advice and look at its spiritual repercussions before making a decision. In the second part of verse 15, Naomi there uses the word return. Now, this is going to be the fourth time that she's using this word as a command. I already told you that in verse 8 and verse 11 and verse 12 she said, return my daughters, return my daughters, return my daughters. And the fourth time now she tells in verse 15, return after your sister-in-law. And now literally she's saying, return by following your sister-in-law. That word after your sister-in-law, after is the word follow. Return by following your sister-in-law. Return to your mother's house by following your sister-in-law. She tells Ruth to follow her sister-in-law. Do what she is doing. Naomi is trying to put Ruth under peer pressure. You see that? Naomi is trying to put Ruth under peer pressure. That's why Ruth then in the next verse, in verse 16 says, do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Actually, that word urge in verse 16 means to put pressure. She tells Naomi, do not put pressure on me to leave you or to turn back from following you. So, what is Naomi trying to do? Naomi is trying to put pressure peer pressure on Ruth. She was telling Ruth, if Orpah did it, why are you also not doing it? She went back to her mother's place. You must also go back to your mother's place. People around you will sometimes tell you to do what others are doing. Others of your similar age, similar background, whatever they are doing, you must also do the same. The pressure to do what others are doing is called peer pressure. But just because others are doing something does not make it a right decision. We must check every decision in the light of our spiritual priorities. Ask yourself these questions before you make a decision. Will my decision take me away from the people of God? Will my decision increase the influence of unbelievers over my life? Will my decision take me away from God? Will my decision take me closer to false religions? And after considering these things, you must make the right decision. Even if that means that you have to stand alone, even if people will question your decision making, even if people were to mock you or call you names, every decision must be made in the light of your spiritual priorities. Because your spiritual life is more valuable than anything else in this world. Your relationship with God is more valuable than any other relationship in this world. That is why Jesus says in Mark chapter 8 and verse 36 to 37, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what will a man give in exchange for his soul? The second point that I want to make, so the first point is that, so people will try to pressurize you to make wrong decisions, but you must, make every decision in the light of your spiritual priorities. So my second point is, be determined in your commitment towards God and His people. Be determined in your commitment towards God and His people. Now, what do we see in Ruth's response that we are going to read now? If I could say this, when I read Ruth's response, I see determination. I see determination. But I got that from verse 18 also, because the author says there that in Ruth's answer, Naomi saw determination. I wanted to read verse 18. Let's read verse 18. See what it says there. That's the last verse of our passage. So after Ruth is going to give a response in verse 16 and 17. And having listened to that response, this is what happens. Verse 18. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So now let's read Ruth's response and see her determination. So Ruth's response is given in verse 16 and 17. Let me just read verse 16 for you right now. It says, but Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. In verse 15, Naomi had commanded Ruth for the fourth time to return to her mother's house. But you see there, these repeated commands from Naomi: return my daughter, return my daughter, return my daughter, return my daughter. It does not shake Ruth's determination. That is why, in response to Naomi's command, Ruth actually gives her own command in verse 16. As I said before, the phrase there in verse 16, do not urge me, it literally means do not pressure me. Can you see, in Asian cultures, daughter-in-laws don't do firm talking with their mother-in-laws. And here is this woman who has to make a firm decision, a firm communication with her mother-in-law. And what does she say? She says, do not pressure me. She takes a determined stand against the pressure that Naomi was trying to create on her. And you will get the feel of her determination in some of the translations. For example, this is what the Net translation says. The Net translation says, it quotes Ruth like this: stop urging me to abandon you. That's what she says there. Stop urging me to abandon you. Now there is no doubt that there was a feeling of mutual love and care for one another between Naomi and Ruth. But Ruth was forced to take a determined stand against Naomi's pressure because she did not want to make the wrong spiritual decision. She wanted to make the right spiritual decision. And so, when pressure comes, if you're not determined, you will wilt under that pressure. And so when pressure comes from people, it's important that you remain determined about the right spiritual decision that you're going to make. She seems to be a person who does not allow people to pressure her to make the wrong spiritual decision. Why? Because ultimately her loyalty was towards God. She wanted to please Him with her decision. You will continue to see that determination in her words. She tells Naomi, do not pressure me to leave you or turn back from following you. Why does she tell Naomi not to pressure her? Because she is determined about what she is going to do. She tells Naomi, for where you go, I will go. Where you live, I will live. So instead of going where Orpah was going, she had resolved to go where Naomi was going. Instead of living where Orpah was going to live, she had resolved to live where Naomi was going to live. Which means that instead of going back to her mother's place in Moab, she resolved to go to Bethlehem in the land of Judah. Ruth had resolved to do exactly the opposite of what her mother-in-law had commanded her to do. I can understand something here. Believers are generally very gentle people. And it should be like that. We should be gentle people. But you cannot make them do something that's against their conscience. When you try to pressurize them to do something that's against their conscience, they will take a firm stand. They will be determined. Why they are like that? Because they are determined to do what is right in the eyes of God. So, when people pressurize you, you will have to take a determined stand. I will not take the wrong decision. I will do what is right. This woman stands as a towering figure in this biblical landscape. You see there men who were waving around here and there. Elimelech and his sons, they did not find food in Judah, they went to Moab. Mahlon and Chilion, they married, they compromised by marrying Moabite women. So these are people who are constantly making compromises. Naomi herself made a compromise, but here is a Moabite woman who is very determined about what she believes. And therefore she stands there as a towering figure for all of us to look at. When pressures come on your life, this is how you stand. Naomi had said in verse 15, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. But notice what Ruth says here in verse 16. She says, your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. You see there, she does not submit to any kind of peer pressure. See that? If you remember, she and Orpah together made the commitment to become part of Naomi's people in verse 10. Let's read that. Ruth chapter 1 verse 10. See what Orpah and Ruth had together said to Naomi. It's written, and they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. But now, what has happened? Orpah has backslidden. She has gone back on her commitment. She has gone back to her people in Moab. She has gone back to her gods. But this does not shake up Ruth's determination. That is why she once again tells Naomi what she told her in verse 10. She says, your people shall be my people. She doubles down on what she knows is right. And acknowledging that they, Naomi's people were the people of God. So acknowledging that they are your people would also mean that their God is your God. And that is why this time Ruth adds this. She says, and your God shall be my God. She not only adopted Israel as her people, but she has also taken refuge under the God of Israel. And this is proven by Boaz's words to her later on in this book. I want you to read what Boaz told her in chapter 2 and verse 11 and 12. Chapter 2 verse 11 and 12. This is what Boaz tells her. Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. See there, I got baptized in 2004, and so this year is the 20th anniversary of my baptism. And I got baptized with two other people, and one of them drifted away from Christian fellowship pretty soon. After taking baptism, he was gone and he never came back to Christian fellowship. And I don't know what's the spiritual condition of the other person. When people who start off with you, their journey of faith with you, they begin to stray away from God and His people, it will be a test of your faith also. Those who started off with you, when they begin to stray, it is a test of your faith also. When people from your own family begin to stray away from God and His people, it will be a test of your faith also. In such circumstances, will you show that you are determined to trust God, and will you continue to be part of His people? Or will you slowly drift away from His people and eventually from God? Ruth did not succumb to any kind of peer pressure. She continued to trust God and continued in her commitment towards God's people. Even though Orpah had backslidden on her commitment, and there was severe pressure on her to follow in Orpah's footsteps, she remained determined. What about you? Where are those who started off with you on your spiritual journey? What is the spiritual condition of your family members? Are they drifting away from Christian fellowship? They don't seem to come to church anymore. They don't seem to be interested in reading scriptures anymore. Are they drifting away from God? And are you also facing the pressure to become like them, to be with them, to follow their lifestyle? Then you must pray to God that you will be able to display the same kind of determination that Ruth displays here. To show the full extent of her commitment to Naomi and to God, Ruth says this in verse 17. She says to Naomi, "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Ruth could have held back on this commitment. She could have always gone back to her people and her gods after the death of Naomi. She was a young woman. Naomi was old. After her death, she could have always gone back. She could have made Moab her final resting place after death. But what is Ruth trying to say here? Ruth is trying to say here, there is no turning back. I have burnt all my bridges. The rest of my life is committed towards God and His people. This shows how determined she was in her commitment towards God and His people. Her commitment towards God and His people was total, not half-hearted. This is the kind of commitment that Jesus demands from His people. And that's made very clear from Jesus' words. I want you to read Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 34 to 39. Matthew chapter 10 verse 34 to 39. This is what Jesus says. "Do not think that I have come to bring peace on the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it." I also want you to read another passage, Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9 and verse 57 to 62. Luke chapter 9, verse 57 to 62. As they were going along the road, someone said to Jesus, "I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." To another, Jesus said, "Follow me." But he said, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." And Jesus said to him, "Leave the dead to bury their own dead. But as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Yet another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but let me first say farewell to those at my home." Jesus said to him, "No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God." You know, what we learn from this passage is that commitment to Jesus and his people would often mean that you would be alienated from the members of your own family. You could be alienated from the members of your own family. Jesus says he did not come to bring peace, but he came to bring a sword, to set a man against his father, to set a daughter against her mother. You know, commitment towards Jesus can cause division in the family. It's a reality that we all need to accept. That's what happened to Ruth. She had to leave her mother's house, her birthplace, because she wanted to follow the God of Israel. We must realize that commitment to Jesus and his people would mean that we would have to often embrace a lot of uncertainties of life. It would also mean that we might not be able to fulfill a lot of social obligations. It will be a life of many sacrifices. That is what it means to take up the cross and follow Jesus. But such a life pleases God. Look what Ruth says in the second part of verse 17. She says, "Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." You know, she takes the name of the God of Israel, Lord, or Yahweh is the word there, which means that she considers the God of Israel to be her personal God. And then she makes an oath to seal her commitment. It shows her determination. She says that if anything other than death should part her and Naomi, then may God's judgment be upon her. You know, that net translation actually puts it very well. It says, "May the Lord punish me severely if I do not keep my promise. Only death will be able to separate me from you." So what this also means is that she understood that if she would keep her commitment toward God and his people till the very end of her life here on earth, then God will be pleased with such a lifelong commitment. You know, New Testament believers do not need to make an oath like Ruth. Our yes or no is as good as an oath. This passage calls us to make a commitment toward God and his people. When people try to pressurize you to leave God and his people, will you still remain determined in your commitment? And will we keep that commitment till the very last breath of our lives? And if we keep these commitments, then God will surely be pleased with us. When we meet the Lord Jesus Christ, he will say to us, "Well done, good and faithful servant." To hear these words is the very goal of our lifelong commitment.